An unassuming, albeit aloof-looking guy in a black suit and sunglasses boards a commercial airliner in 1971. The beginning of a regular nothing of a day. Until it wasn't. Today, the story of D.B. Cooper, a man who started the day as an airline passenger and ended it parachuting into the Pacific Northwest's deep forests, leaving no trace behind, and only the legend that has grown as large as Paul Bunyon himself, cementing D.B. Cooper as an American folk legend. Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. On what has become one of the busiest traveling days of the year, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, November 24th in 1971, an unassuming man walked up to the Northwest Orient Airlines flight counter at the Portland International Airport. He was a white male, mid-40s, with dark hair and brown eyes. He was around 5 feet 10 inches tall, around 180 pounds, with an olive skin tone and no discernible accent. He was wearing a business suit in either black or brown, a white shirt, a thin black tie, a black raincoat, and brown shoes. This man had some odd brown and black mixing fashion sense. He bought a one-way ticket on Flight 305, a 30-minute trip north to Seattle-Tacoma International, hereby known as it is more generally known, SeaTac. He paid $18.52 or $138.36 in modern 2023 dollars in cash and gave his name as Dan Cooper. We've talked about this before on Capers and Cocktails, but going on a plane in 1971 was way, way different than it is today. There was no more security than in a grocery store. There were no metal detectors, no searches of you or your luggage, and certainly no drug-sniffing dogs. Buying a same-day ticket and hopping on an airplane was not unusual. Flying was casual at that time, actually by design. And giving a fake name was possible without much hassle because, well, they didn't even check your ID when you bought a plane ticket. Dan boarded at the back of a Boeing 727-100 at 2 o'clock p.m., carrying a brown paper bag and a briefcase. Dan was now wearing sunglasses, which, although made one passenger at least think he was pretentious, didn't ring any real alarm bells or set off any suspicions. There were 36 passengers, including Dan, and 6 crew members. Dan took a seat in 18E at the last row and ordered a bourbon and 7-Up from the flight attendant, Florence Schaffner. Northwest Orient had a policy in place to serve customers even before the flight took off, and generally speaking, flying in the 1970s was a party. Often at the misogynistic expense of the mostly female flight attendants, but a cigarette-smoking, cheap-drinking, big-screen movie-playing, complimentary shot glass souvenir-getting party nonetheless. And because we're telling his tale today, we're going to make D.B. Cooper's simple drink, a 7 and 7, which turns out to be not only D.B. Cooper's drink of choice, but one of the most popular drinks of the 1970s as a whole. A 7 and 7 traditionally uses Seagram's 7 Crown blended whiskey, whatever that means, and enough 7-Up to make you forget that you're drinking a blended whiskey. I can't be sure which kind of whiskey the Northwest Orient served, Dan, but I think it'll taste pretty much the same no matter which whiskey you use. For the cocktail, take 1 part whiskey and put it in a glass with ice. Top with 7-Up to taste. For the mocktail, replace the Seagram 7 with a non-alcoholic whiskey of your choice. My choice is listed and linked in the description box. Top with 7-Up and sip like the smooth criminal you wish you were. Speaking of smooth criminals, shortly after this short flight took off, Dan slipped a note to Florence, who was sitting in a jump seat directly behind him. She assumed it was his digits and a request for a date, insert eye roll here, so she dropped the note into her purse unread. Dan leaned toward her, whispering, quote, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb," end quote. She pretty quickly unfolded it and read a note neatly printed in capital letters with a felt-tipped pen. Quote, "Miss, I have a bomb here and I would like you to sit by me," end quote. Dan opened the briefcase long enough for Florence to see that this wasn't a phony claim. She saw for herself red cylinders in 2 rows, which she assumed was dynamite. Attached to the cylinders was a wire and a large cylindrical battery, or maybe a clock. All of this looked to Florence like a big old bomb. Florence went to the back of the plane and casually dropped the note on the ground, motioning for fellow flight attendant Tina Mucklow to pick it up. Florence then buckled in next to Dan. Tina reached for the phone next to her and called the pilots, explaining what was happening. Now, if you'll remember, in the 4 years from 1968 to 1972, a period dubbed the Golden Age of hijacking, more than 130 airplanes were skyjacked. Sometimes it would happen more than once in the same day. Most of these folks were individuals with a political axe to grind or a strong desire for some quick ransom cash. Most of the time, these incidents ended in something resembling an inconvenience versus a mass tragedy. Being midway through this golden period and undoubtedly having been briefed on what to do in the case of a skyjacking, it behooved the flight crew to remain perfectly calm and do exactly what this mysterious, sunglassed fella required. So that's what the crew did. Sometime in the beginning, Tina actually began to act as that go-between Dan and the crew. She sat next to him and transcribed his demands. $200,000 in American cash by 5 o'clock p.m., 2 front parachutes, 2 back parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting on the ground in Seattle. She phoned the demands to the cockpit. Flight Captain William A. Scott radioed Northwest Flight Operations in Minnesota and relayed Dan's demands. Naturally, local police and the FBI were also contacted by SeaTac Air Traffic Control. The president of Northwest Orient at the time, Donald Nyrup, authorized the ransom payment and told everyone to comply with Dan's demands and cooperate fully. Tina continued to act as that go-between, sitting with Dan and then radioing updates to his demands. The plan was laid out in more detail and specific instructions were given. Upon landing in Seattle, the fuel trucks must meet the plane. While the money was brought on board, first, all passengers must remain seated. Once he had the money, he would release them. The 4 parachutes should be brought aboard last. For around 2 hours, Flight 304 circled Puget Sound to give authorities time to assemble Dan's demands and to mobilize emergency personnel. Passengers were told there was a delay because of a minor mechanical difficulty. Seems odd that in a minor mechanical difficulty situation, you would continue to, fly in the air, but who am I to say? Apparently, most, if not all of the passengers were actually none the wiser. They kept drinking their 7 and 7s and smoking up a storm. Dan himself would smoke 8 cigarettes throughout the evening on the plane. While circling the airport, Tina asked Dan why he picked that particular airline to skyjack, to which he replied, quote, "It's not because I have a grudge against your airlines, it's just because I have a grudge." End quote. But he was indeed a smooth criminal. Tina would later say that, quote, "he was not nervous. He seemed rather nice and he was not cruel or nasty," end quote. At one point, he offered to tip the flight attendants, but they refused, citing our airline policy. Meanwhile, officials on the ground were scrambling to meet the demands of the Skyjacker. They managed to secure 10,000 $20 bills from Seattle First National Bank, which they put into a bank bag that would have weighed around 19 pounds. This was an ingenious move on the part of officials, as these bills were already prepped and marked to be used in case of a bank robbery, so the serial numbers were easily accessible. Authorities then worked quickly to find the parachutes, which actually at this time were not easy to find. It's not like today. There weren't a lot of commercial, skydiving experiences. They did finally manage to track down a local stunt pilot, Earl J. Cossey, who grabbed 4 parachutes. Pay attention here because these actually become an important part of the story. One back or main parachute was a military parachute. This parachute would slow an ascent more effectively, but was unable to be steered once it was opened. The second was a back parachute that was a skydiving parachute. It had the ability to steer. one front or reserve parachute that was fully functioning, and one front or reserve parachute that was used for training purposes only, and so apparently was a dummy parachute. I think this is a bad idea, but anyway, it was marked with an X on the front so that skydivers didn't accidentally use it in flight. The reserve chute had a canopy inside that was sewn together so that skydiving students could get the feel of pulling a ripcord on a packed parachute without the canopy actually deploying. With the fuel trucks, money, and parachutes ready to go, Flight 305 landed at SeaTac at 5:46 p.m., a little bit past Dan's time request. Captain Scott parked the plane away from the main terminal. Next, Dan had everyone lower the shade on the airplane windows, fearing snipers. Oh, and he was right to fear them. Authorities had positioned snipers on the ground. Dan demanded that one representative of the airline approach the plane with the chutes and money. Everyone would use the front door of the plane using the rolling staircase, like they used to use on all the planes. Anyway, the rolling staircase on the tarmac. Tina went out of the plane first to collect the ransom. She came back onto the plane and carried the money back past the seated passengers to Dan in the last row. Dan inspected the money as the passengers were permitted to disembark the plane. Tina made 3 additional trips to get the parachutes, which she also brought to him. She also brought printed instructions for using the parachutes, but Dan said he didn't need them. Florence and the other flight attendant, Alice Hancock, asked if they could leave, and Dan said, quote, "Whatever you girls would like," end quote. And well, they liked the idea of leaving, so they exited the plane. Dan became frustrated with the bag the money had been delivered in. Remember, it was just a bank bag. He had asked for something with straps, so he had to make his own. So to create his own strappable bag, he cut the canopy from the working reserve parachute and stuffed the money into his newly made bag. Dan started to also get impatient with the refueling process, saying, quote, "Let's get this show on the road," end quote. So they did. The next set of instructions were both puzzling and, interesting to later Cooper sleuths. He wanted a southeast course toward Mexico City, going as slowly as possible, approximately 115 miles per hour. They should fly no higher than 10,000 feet, and not only should the landing gear remain deployed, but the wing flaps should be lowered 15 degrees, and the cabin should remain depressurized. The pilots didn't think that the plane could even physically maintain that altitude and speed, and Dan said, quote, "It can be done. Do it," end quote. He also insisted that the aft or back staircase be left open as they took off, but relented that demand when being assured that the plane couldn't actually take off if those stairs were lowered. He demanded Tina stay on board to help him lower the staircase in the air. First Officer Bill Radizak let Dan know that because of his requirements, they would have to land again before arriving in Mexico City to refuel, and they all agreed upon Reno. After they took off, less than 5 minutes into the flight, Dan told Tina to lower the aft staircase. She asked if she could go to the cockpit and get some rope to tie herself to a seat so that she wouldn't be sucked out of the airplane. Dan said no, saying he didn't want her to go into the cockpit or for the flight crew to come out of the cockpit. But when Tina asked again if she could do it because she was scared, he said, well, basically forget it, and that he would open the stairs himself. He told her to go to the first class cabin, close the curtain. Well, it's not really a cabin, right? There's just a curtain in between, but to close the curtain and not come back. Her last request was that he take the bomb with him. Dan reassured her that he would either take the bomb or disarm it. As Tina went to close the curtain, she saw him tying his makeshift money bag around his waist. She would be the last person to ever see D.B. Cooper. Well, that we know of. Meanwhile, on the ground, authorities scrambled F-106 fighters from the McChord Air Force Base and a Lockheed T-33 trainer diverted from a different Air National Guard mission to follow the hijacked plane. They flew in an S pattern to stay behind the slow-moving plane and out of sight of Dan. Back on the plane, as Tina went into the cockpit, Dan strapped the functioning military parachute on his back and the dummy reserve parachute on his front. Around 8 o'clock p.m., a warning light flashed in the cockpit showing that the aft staircase had been deployed. The pilot called to Dan from the intercom to see if he needed any help, and Dan, in his last known words spoken, said no. At approximately 8:13 p.m., the crew felt a jolt in the plane pitch somewhere near the suburbs north of Portland. Dan was gone. But the mystery of his flight would captivate people for more than half a century after. At 11:02 p.m., with the aft staircase still lowered, Flight 305 landed at Reno Tahoe International Airport. Not sure if Dan was still aboard, Captain Scott searched the cabin, and their suspicion that Dan was gone was confirmed. After a 30-minute search from the FBI bomb squad, the cabin was cleared. Dan had taken the bomb with him off the plane. FBI agents gathered the following evidence from the plane. In the armrest ashtray of Dan's seat, they found 8 Raleigh filter-tipped cigarette butts. No fingerprints could be found on them, and then they were inadvertently destroyed by the Las Vegas FBI field office. So much for DNA on those. They found Dan's black clip-on tie in seat 18E, where Dan was sitting. It had a circular gold and mother-of-pearl tie clip attached. The FBI found that the tie had been sold at JCPenney stores, only JCPenney department stores, and had stopped being manufactured in 1968. In 2001, samples of DNA were found on the tie, and by late 2007, a partial DNA profile had been built by the FBI, but no evidence actually linked Dan to the source of the sample. They couldn't say, this is his, it's just on the tie. Anyway, in March of 2009, a group of citizen sleuths analyzed hundreds of organic and metallic particles on the tie and suggested that Dan may have worked for Boeing or another aeronautical engineering company at a plant that made chemicals or at a plant that made things out of metal. Apparently, on the tie, there were small particles of unalloyed titanium, which was rare and only used at facilities like the ones I just said. They also found 2 hair samples. They found a single strand of limb hair on the seat and a single strand of brown head hair on the headrest. Apparently, however, the hair samples were lost, so no useful DNA will be pulled from those, ever. 2 of the 4 parachutes were also left on the plane. The functioning front parachute that had 3 shroud lines cut from the canopy, and the sport back parachute. 66 latent fingerprints were found also around the airplane. And now, why has Jessica been calling D.B. Cooper Dan the entire episode? Well, his name was never D.B. Cooper, that's why. The FBI, naturally, began immediately questioning possible suspects and believed that he may have used his real name to book the flight. So they tracked down and interviewed a man from Portland named D.B. Cooper. He was quickly eliminated as a suspect, but in a rush to meet his deadline, reporter James Long reported the suspect's name as D.B. Cooper. All of a sudden, his name was being misreported as DB. And let's be honest, DB Cooper is a way cooler name than Dan. So pretty much everyone except for me goes with DB when talking about him. Well, I'm nothing if not stubborn, so let's just keep calling him his given name or the name he gave, shall we? The search area was massive and not easily searchable. Factors like the jet's airspeed, the environmental conditions, and how long Dan remained in freefall before pulling the ripcord all made a possible landing site almost impossible to pinpoint. Add to that a man dressed in black jumping into a very dark, cloudy night with no lighting on the ground. The pilots of the planes trailing the 727 saw absolutely nothing. Nonetheless, the FBI spent untold amounts of money. I actually could not find the amount, but I'm guessing it was more than 200,000 1971 American dollars. They spent a lot of money retracing and photographing the flight's flight path, doing experiments with sleds to try and determine the landing zone, and searching for the items Dan carried during his jump. They did door-to-door searches of local farmhouses and ran patrol boats along 2 lakes closest to the area where Dan jumped. They used helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft from the Oregon Army National Guard to search the entire flight path from Seattle to Reno. They used a submarine to search the depths of Lake Merwin. They used early computer projections to estimate Dan's drop zone, and they found precisely nothing. Not a single search of the areas identified as the original drop zone and updated drop zones have produced discoveries traceable to the skyjacking. Some have even speculated that when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, it obliterated any physical clues to the skyjacking. Let's talk a little bit about the money. $10,000 $20 bills that Dan Cooper made a makeshift bag for and strapped to his stomach before launching himself into the oblivion of Washington state. Remember, these bills were all marked, but you have to know to look for the bills, right? A random cashier at a grocery store isn't exactly checking serial numbers for Dan's dollar bills. A month after the skyjacking, the FBI distributed the serial numbers to banks, casinos, and racetracks, places that would often deal in large amounts of cash. In early 1972, the serial numbers were released to the public, and nothing other than some people that tried to, scam people. But anyway, evidently, about 3 hours after Dan jumped, a burglary was reported at a small grocery store near Hazen, Washington, an unincorporated community located within the calculated drop zone. The burglar took survival items like beef jerky and gloves, but nothing further came from that burglary other than speculation. A variety of rewards have been offered for the return of the recovered money and the positive identification of Dan, including Northwest Orient, who offered $25,000, the Oregon Journal, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and Richard Tosaw, a retired FBI agent who offered his own $25,000 reward as a private citizen. And nothing. In retrospect, Dan Cooper made some fairly ingenious, well-thought-out decisions in his quest for financial freedom. To start, when he demanded 2 sets of parachutes, there was an implication that he planned to take a hostage with him when he jumped out of the plane, and that discouraged authorities from supplying him with rigged or malfunctioning equipment. It was actually an accident that the dummy front parachute was supplied to Dan. Authorities had intended to give him 4 fully functioning parachutes. Tina would say that Dan seemed familiar with the local terrain. He was able to identify Tacoma as they flew over it, and he noted the McCord Air Force Base, a 20-minute drive from SeaTac. Dan knew something about planes, at least enough to know that the 727-100 was the only plane in the Boeing fleet that had aft or back stairs. He knew the speed that the plane could fly, even more so than the pilots of that aircraft knew, and the altitude that it could fly. He knew the 727-100 very well. Even according to Tina, he, quote, seemed specifically well-informed to refueling procedures, end quote. And First Officer Bill Radizak, who spoke with Dan on the intercom during the skyjacking, told the FBI that Dan, quote, displayed a specific knowledge of flying an aircraft in general, end quote. He strategically chose a seat in the last row of the rear cabin. He could see what was happening in front of him, and he would be a little undercover from the rest of the passengers. The choice of a bomb, which, by the way, it's actually believed that the bomb was fake. Dynamite isn't really wrapped in red paper. That's just for the movies. But anyway, he knew that a bomb would keep people from rushing him to take him down. He demanded all the notes he'd written to be returned to him, as well as taking the matchbook that had been used to light his cigarettes. He took almost everything out of the plane with him, forgetting, of course, the cigarette butts, because it was 1971 and DNA was not a thing. And somehow, he also forgot his clip-on tie. 3 composite sketches were completed of Dan Cooper. Composite A, released during the first year of the investigation, was, at least according to eyewitnesses, not an accurate likeness of Dan. Some even called the sketch Bing Crosby. Flight attendant Florence Schaffner told the FBI over and over that the Composite A sketch didn't look anything like Dan. As a result of that, Composite B was released in late 1972. And while eyewitnesses agreed that the image was more accurate, they said that Dan looked too angry. FBI artists tweaked Composite B and released the final sketch on January 2nd, 1973. One of the flight attendants said that the last composite was a very close resemblance to Dan. And another would say, quote, the Skyjacker would be easily recognized from this sketch, end quote. Accepting that no one recognized him ever, or at least they never said anything about it if they did. There has been a long list of potential DB Coopers over the years, a long list, but I'm going to do something a little different than most podcasters and documentarians and general sleuths. I'm not going to name these people. They're They're not even suspects. Anyway, you can Google and find all the individual information about those people that you want. There are ex-military guys, generally angry guys with an axe to grind, guys who needed money, some people's uncles, and at least a few women. There are entire documentary series dedicated to specific suspects. But truth be told, most of those people have already been ruled out, either by eyewitnesses or by DNA evidence. Yes, even the ones that have been ruled out have documentaries made about them. This case is fraught with confirmation bias from many of the armchair sleuths that have dived headfirst into the mystery. So, I'm going to more generally describe what I think were the characteristics of a good D.B. Cooper suspect. 1. I think he had a military background. For one, he chose the military parachute, and apparently, at least according to Tina, he, quote, put on his parachute as though he did so every day, end quote. Remember, he didn't even want the instructions. And he had to have at least enough basic working knowledge of jumping out of an airplane, including the needed altitude and speed. He may have been in the Air Force, considering, the ability to jump out of a plane. And also that he could recognize locations from above. He also knew that McChord Air Force Base was about 20 minutes driving time from SeaTac Airport. That's not something that the average Joe just knows. 2. Speaking of something that the average Joe does not know, it's that the 727 aft staircase could be used mid-flight. He also knew that the single activation switch in the rear of the cabin could not be overridden from the cockpit. The FBI thought Dan might have known that during the Vietnam War, the CIA used 727s to drop spies and supplies into enemy territory. Since this wouldn't be necessary on a passenger flight, civilian crews weren't told that the aft air stair could be dropped in the middle of the flight. And they also weren't told that the process couldn't be stopped from the cockpit. If it turns out that Dan was CIA or former CIA, then that explains a lot about the non-Googleable, because there was no Google people, knowledge about these things and about the scrambling of some high-powered jets to find this guy. 3. He was most likely in desperate need of cash. Ralph Himmelsbach, a former FBI chief agent, says that thieves and extortionists who steal large amounts of money almost always do so because they need the cash right away. If they didn't, he says, the crime isn't worth the big risk. 4. He was a smoker and not so much of a drinker. Seems he preferred the stinky style of 1970s stress management. 5. He seemed to be more highly educated or more intelligent. He had a sophisticated vocabulary, was relatively calm throughout the event, and quite adaptable when deviations from his plan came up. 6. He seemed polite and kind to women, and let's just say not every man on an airplane in the 1970s was polite to the often scantily dressed stewardesses, flight attendants on board. 7. He was the kind of guy who would wear a clip-on tie. So he either had a pretty bad fashion sense or he was in some kind of disguise. Not the kind of guy who typically wore a suit. Some FBI agents thought that Dan got his fake name from a famous French language Belgian comic book series about a test pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force named Dan Cooper, who went on many great adventures, such as parachuting. The FBI website has a picture of a cover from the series that shows test pilot Dan Cooper skydiving. They thought he might have found them while on duty in Europe, because the Dan Cooper books were never translated into English or brought into the United States. I don't put as much stock into this theory as I think it might actually just be a coincidence, and Dan didn't have an accent. Yes, I know you can speak a foreign language and not have an accent, but I don't know, it just feels like a coincidence. In November 1978, a deer hunter found a 727's instruction sign for lowering the aft air stair. It was found near a logging road about 13 miles east of Castle Rock, Washington, but within Flight 305's basic flight path, and it did come from the flight. On February 10, 1980, Brian Ingram, then 8 years old, was on vacation with his family on the Columbia River. They were at Tina Bar, a beachfront area about 9 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. When Brian went to rake the sand to make a fire, he found 3 packages of money worth about $5,800 in the riverbank. Technicians from the FBI confirmed that the money was part of Dan's ransom. There were 3 packets of $90 bills, 2 packets of $100 bills each, and the money was ordered in the same way that it was given to Dan. A lot of new theories were made after the finding, and in the end, it raised more questions than it answered. Investigators and scientific experts' first comments were based on the idea that the bundles of bills fell into the Columbia River from one of its many connecting streams, or I guess was carried. An Army Corps of Engineers hydrologist said the bills had broken up in a rounded way and were matted together, which meant that they had been deposited by river action instead of being buried on purpose. If that result was right, it backed the idea that Dan had not landed near Lake Merwin or any river that flows into the Columbia from the Lewis River, which is a long way downstream from Tina Bar. It also supported more rumors that the drop zone was near the Washougal River, which flows into the Columbia upstream of where the money was found. It was hard to believe in this, quote, free-floating theory because it didn't explain why 10 bills were missing from one packet or how the 3 packs would have stayed together after being separated from the rest of the money. Geological evidence showed that the bills got to Tina Bar after 1974, which was the year that the Corps of Engineers dredged that part of the river. After a long time of talks, the found bills were split evenly between Brian Ingram and Northwest Orient's insurance company, Royal Globe Insurance. The FBI kept 14 bills for evidence. In 2008, little Brian, who wasn't so little anymore, auctioned off 15 of his bills for about $37,000, which is about $50,000 today. The ransom money found in the Columbia River is still the only physical proof of the skyjacking that has been found outside of the plane. On July 8th, 2016, the FBI announced that they were finished actively investigating the case of D.B. Cooper, although local field offices will continue to accept any legitimate physical evidence that may appear in the future. The FBI said in part, quote, "Every time the FBI assesses additional time for the Norjack case, investigative resources and manpower are diverted from programs that more urgently need attention," end quote. Norjack stands for Northwest Hijacking, by the way. I'm wondering why they didn't just call it the D.B. Cooper case. The FBI always wants to be so professional, don't they? Whatever. Anyway, it seems like even the FBI believes this is a mystery that will never be solved. The 66-volume case file has been preserved and lives at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and is also on their website. All of the evidence is open to the public. So, what happened to Dan? From the beginning of the investigation, FBI agents did not believe Dan Cooper survived his jump. According to one agent, quote, "No experienced parachutist would have jumped in the pitch black night in the rain with a 17-mile-per-hour wind in his face, wearing loafers and a trench coat. It was simply too risky," end quote. I mean, you wouldn't do that unless you just asked for $1 million and were trying to escape, but I digress. It was also really cold, like really cold. It was 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's before the wind chill. And he was not wearing proper protection. Well, maybe. Dan did have a bag, which may have included boots, gloves, goggles, or maybe even a well-packed coat. Skydiving instructors have testified that Dan could have survived the jump, but likely would have gotten some serious leg injuries when landing because it was dark outside. But even if he had survived his jump, he landed somewhere random with not much other than a bundle of cash and some loafers. I suppose he could have walked right out of the woods and went home with his cash in his hand. Some agree with me. Even some FBI agents agree with me. In the months after the D.B. Cooper skyjacking, 5 men tried to do the same thing, and all 5 of them made it through their parachute escapes. The fact that the copycats lived, many of them in situations and conditions similar to Dan's jump, gives us pause when thinking about Dan's chances of survival. Dan's skyjacking and several others that happened the next year led to big improvements in airport and commercial flight security. At airports, metal detectors were put in place, bags had to be inspected, and people who paid cash for their tickets on the day of departure were given extra attention. Boeing 727s were modified with Cooper vanes that were meant to stop the back stairs from lowering while the plane was in the air. The device is made up of a flat metal blade that is attached to a pivot. The blade is spring-loaded to stay out of the way of the door when the craft is at rest, but when the plane is in flight, it turns into place to keep the door from opening. The gear moves automatically, and you can't stop it from inside the cabin. In direct response to the kidnapping, all cockpit doors had to have peepholes installed. This let the flight crew see what's going on inside the cabin without having to open the cockpit door. By 1973, the number of skyjackings had decreased significantly, seemingly because the new security measures scared off people who only wanted to steal planes for some quick cash. I guess in the adventure of jumping out of a plane. In November 1976, John Doe, aka Dan Cooper, was charged by a Portland grand jury with air piracy and violating the Hobbs Act. This charge officially started the case, which will continue if the hijacker is caught at any point in the future. So, no statute of limitations for Dan Cooper. If they find him and he's alive, the FBI will get their man. Larry Carr, an FBI investigator, would say, quote, "Diving into the wilderness without a plan, without the right equipment, in such terrible conditions, he probably never even got his chute open," end quote. Yeah, the odds are pretty good that whoever jumped out of that plane on Thanksgiving Day died. Yeah, the odds are pretty good that whoever jumped out of that plane on Thanksgiving Eve died before they even hit the ground, or as they hit the ground. But for some reason, I'd like to think that D.B. Cooper got away with it. I guess probably a lot of people do. But why? What makes us romanticize this wildly criminal act? To root for the bad guy? Do we all wish we could pull off such a daring heist? Do we just want an ending to the story? John Highbush, former executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, says, quote, "The Western world has to have an answer to every question. And it's really frustrating to them when a story doesn't have an ending. Doesn't have to be a happy ending, but it needs a period at the end of the sentence." The D.B. Cooper is a prime example of a sentence that's been left uncompleted, end quote. In the end, it was a mostly victimless crime in a bygone era of buying a cheap plane ticket the day of and getting your drink before the airplane even takes off. It is jumping out of a plane with a stack of cash and starting a new life, never to be seen again. For some, it's an obsession. At the end of the day, it seems like the story of D.B. Cooper isn't really about D.B. Cooper. It's about the people like us who get wrapped up in this scavenger hunt and potential glory. As my grandpa says, everybody knows D.B. Cooper. And as author and D.B. Cooper hunter Jeffrey Gray says, quote, "The only one more famous in the world than D.B. Cooper is the person who finds him," end quote. For most of us, I guess it's rooting for the little guy, fighting against the man, and maybe, just maybe, getting away with it. In fact, the case of D.B. Cooper is, to this day, the only unsolved case of air piracy in commercial aviation history. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm sorry this episode is a week delayed. You can imagine I fell down a tremendous number of rabbit holes with this one. It's one of those episodes where honestly there's just too much information, and the sifting took more time than I thought it would. And as you may have noticed, I am coming in right at my own deadline of even getting it out on a Tuesday night, the second Tuesday of the month. At one point, I had 45 pages of research. I should write a book. For the month of January only, I'm going to just rearrange my skipped upload, and so there will be Thursday episodes for the rest of the month. And then next month, starting in February, we will skip the third Tuesday of the month. Season 4 of the podcast is going to be the best one yet. We've got dumb criminals, cults, and heists. Oh my. This month alone, we have drinks from 3 different countries and 3 different centuries. Go ahead and follow me on the 4 major social media platforms to help other people get on the CNC train. Toot toot. Sorry. I'll see you next week. And remember, if you try to do what D.B. Cooper did, you probably won't get away with it.